You stand outside a London orphanage on New Year's Eve, 1926, watching snow fall through the yellow glow of street lamps, and inside those cold stone walls, a baby is crying with a fury that seems almost too knowing, too ancient for something so new to the world. The nurses at Wool's orphanage don't know it yet, but they've just received a child who will one day make their institution infamous. A boy whose mother stumbled through their doors long enough to give birth and whisper a name, Tom Riddle, before her broken heart simply stopped beating. Exhausted by magic she'd used to ensnare a man who never loved her back. You move through the corridors of this grim building, past peeling wallpaper and the smell of boiled cabbage, and you notice how the other children instinctively avoid the dark-haired boy in the corner, the one who never cries when he's punished, who watches everything with eyes too old and calculating for his 7 years. The matron, Mrs. Cole, takes to gin a little earlier each year, and she'll later tell a professor with half-moon spectacles about the funny things that happened around young Tom. Rabbits hung from rafters, children going missing for hours in places they couldn't possibly reach, whispered threats that somehow always came true in the most unsettling ways. Here's a thought that might tickle you. Even in the 1930s, orphanages were supposed to be places of Christian charity, yet Tom Riddle learned his first lessons in power within walls, decorated with crosses and scripture, proving that darkness doesn't need Gothic castles to flourish, just human neglect and a brilliant mind left to its own devices. You watch him at age 9, already conducting experiments on the other children's fears, already understanding that people will do almost anything to avoid pain, already collecting secrets like other boys collect marbles, storing each one away for future use with the methodical precision of someone far beyond his years. In 1938, when most British children were being fitted for gas masks and listening to worried adults discuss something called appeasement with a German chancellor, Tom Riddle received a visitor who arrived in a shower of flames from the orphanage fireplace, and you see the moment his entire world cracks open to reveal possibilities he'd only sensed in his bones. Albus Dumbledore, young then and not yet weathered by the wars to come, sits on Tom's thin mattress and explains magic, and you notice the boy doesn't gasp or laugh with delight like other Muggle-born children. Instead, he leans forward with an expression of satisfaction as if the universe has finally confirmed what he always suspected about his own superiority. Scholars still debate whether Tom Riddle was born evil or made that way by his conception under a love potion's influence, as if the question of nature versus nurture could somehow explain how one person could fracture their soul 7 times and still function, still scheme, still pursue power with single-minded devotion that bordered on beautiful in its terrible purity. The historical record shows us something peculiar. During this exact period, psychologist John Bowlby was developing his attachment theory, studying children in orphanages, and concluding that maternal deprivation could cause permanent psychological damage. But Tom didn't just suffer damage. He weaponized it, transforming every slight and every lonely night into fuel for a furnace that would eventually consume everything human about him. You follow him through his first days at Wool's, after Dumbledore's "Forever serves you. Watching him practice controlling fire, making things move with his mind, speaking to the garden snake in sibilant whispers that sound like water over stones, and you notice he
Never shares his joy, never seeks to connect, only to dominate, only to prove.
Here's where it gets darkly funny. The very same British establishment that would later mobilize to fight totalitarianism abroad was simultaneously running institutions like Wool's orphanage with such cold efficiency that they practically mass-produced damaged children, though admittedly most of them didn't go on to become immortal dark wizards. Most of them just lived quiet lives of desperate normalcy, forever trying to outrun the shadows of those loveless years. The summer of 1938 crawls toward September, and Tom Riddle counts down the days until Hogwarts with the focus of a general planning a campaign. already learning to charm Mrs. Cole when he needs something, already perfecting the handsome smile that will serve him so well among the pure-blood families who pride themselves on their ability to read character. You watch him steal from the other children without remorse, a toy soldier here, a precious photograph there. Not because he wants these things, but because he can, because each theft proves his superiority, his ability to operate outside the petty moral frameworks that constrain lesser beings. In historical context, this is the year of Kristallnacht, when the world got a preview of the industrial-scale evil humans could achieve when they decided certain lives had no value, and while young Tom likely never read newspaper accounts of shattered synagogue windows, he was absorbing the same essential lesson, that power, ruthlessly applied, could reshape reality according to one's will, and that the masses would either follow or get out of the way. The peculiar detail that historians of magic love to examine is Tom's box of treasures kept under a loose floorboard, a yo-yo that had belonged to a bully who later lost the use of his arm, a silver thimble from a girl who developed a mysterious fear of small spaces, a cracked marble that used to belong to a boy who woke up one morning unable to speak for a week. These weren't souvenirs of affection, but trophies of dominance. Each one a small victory in his private war against a world that had given him nothing, that had taken his mother and denied him his father, that had locked him in this prison of ordinary, magicless mediocrity. You feel the anticipation building in him as September 1st approaches, the delicious certainty that finally, he's going to a place where his abilities won't be aberrations to hide but powers to hone, where his difference will elevate him rather than isolate him, where the name Tom Riddle will mean something, will command respect, will be remembered long after all these ordinary children and their ordinary lives have turned to dust and been forgotten by history's relentless march forward into the future. He plans to dominate. You stand on platform 9 3/4 for the first time through Tom Riddle's 11-year-old eyes, and the assault of color and noise and casual magic being performed by families who've known this world since birth fills you with something between wonder and a cold, calculating envy that will never entirely fade. The Hogwarts Express gleams red in the September morning, and you watch Tom observe everything, the way pure-blood children are surrounded by parents and siblings, the way they laugh about summer holidays in places with names like Wiltshire and Cornwall, the way they casually discuss relatives at the ministry as if having powerful connections is the most natural thing in the world, which to them, of course, it is. Here's an amusing irony. Tom Riddle boards the train to Hogwarts the same year that Orson Welles broadcasts War of the Worlds and convinces thousands of Americans that Martians are invading New Jersey, proving that the Muggle world had its own brand of magic in the form of mass media and collective panic. Though Tom would always consider Muggle achievements inferior, would never quite grasp that fear wielded through art was its own kind of power. You settle into a compartment with him, watching as he already begins the work of constructing his persona, smiling at the right moments, asking questions that make pure-blood children feel knowledgeable and important, never revealing the orphanage, never mentioning the mother who died or the father who abandoned him, presenting instead a careful fiction of a family abroad, circumstances beyond his control, calculated vagueness that people fill in with their own generous assumptions. The countryside rolls past the window in shades of green that the London orphan has rarely seen, and you notice how Tom catalogs everything. The spell a sixth year performs to heat their tea, the way another student summons their trunk from overhead, the casual mention of house elves and family grimoires and summer trips to magical communities in France. Each detail filed away in his extraordinary memory for future use, future leverage, future power plays still years in the making. Scholars endlessly debate whether the Sorting Hat genuinely reads minds or simply responds to self-perception and desire, but when it touches Tom Riddle's head, you feel the electric moment of connection. the hat delving into ambition so vast it could swallow the school whole, sorting him into Slytherin before he's even fully sat down on the stool, before the hall is finished applauding the previous student, as if even this ancient magical artifact wants to minimize its contact with something so driven, so unquestionably destined for darkness or greatness or both. Here's a historical oddity that would have delighted Tom. In 1938, the same year he started at Hogwarts, archaeologists in Iraq discovered the Baghdad Battery, a clay pot that might have been used for electroplating 2,000 years ago, suggesting that ancient peoples had knowledge that supposedly came much later. And Tom would have loved this idea, this evidence that history hides secrets, that the past contains power modern people have forgotten, that with sufficient research and ruthlessness, one might recover what was lost and bend it to contemporary purposes. You watch him navigate his first months at Hogwarts with the skill of a born politician, identifying the students who matter, the Blacks, the Malfoys, the Lestranges, the ones whose blood runs pure and whose family trees never branch toward Muggle roots, and making himself useful, charming, indispensable to them in small ways that create debts and dependencies. His professors adore him almost instantly because he's everything they claim to want. Brilliant, hardworking, curious about magic in all its forms, polite to authority, and possessed of a work ethic that makes other students look lazy by comparison, though none of them except Dumbledore seem to notice the coldness behind his eyes, the way his smile never quite reaches those dark, watchful depths. The common room beneath the lake becomes his laboratory for social experimentation, and you observe him learning to inspire loyalty in some students through charisma, fear in others through carefully orchestrated accidents that can never quite be traced back to him, creating a circle of followers who aren't quite friends. Tom Riddle doesn't have friends, doesn't want friends, sees friendship as a weakness that creates exploitable emotional dependencies, but who are useful, who amplify his influence, who can be deployed like chess pieces in the long game he's already playing. In December of his first year, while the rest of Britain worries about whether Prime Minister Chamberlain's peace strategy will prevent war with Germany, Tom Riddle receives no Christmas presents, no packages from home, and he watches the other students open gifts from families who love them with an expression you can't quite read. Not sadness, not exactly envy, but something colder, a hardening of resolve, a silent promise that one day he'll be so powerful that love, family, and all those soft human connections won't matter, that he'll transcend the need for such things entirely through sheer magical dominance. The historical context here gets deliciously dark. This is the era of the British boarding school system at its most rigid, with corporal punishment still common and emotional repression considered character building. So Hogwarts's relative kindness might have been disorienting to Tom, who'd learned to associate adult attention with punishment, who had to recalibrate his entire approach to authority figures who actually seemed to care about students' magical development, even if their care never penetrated the walls he'd built around whatever passed for his heart. You follow him into the library, where he reads everything he can find about famous wizards, powerful families, the structure of magical society, and most tellingly, the nature of death itself, already starting to formulate the question that will consume his life. Why should wizards, blessed with powers that transcend natural law, still be subject to mortality's final constraint, still have to face the same end as powerless muggles who never wielded a wand or spoke a spell? Here's where the scholarly debate gets fascinating. Some historians argue Tom Riddle's obsession with immortality stemmed from his mother's early death, a trauma he never processed. Others suggest it was pure intellectual arrogance, the logical extension of a brilliant mind that refused to accept any limitation. Still others point to the symbolic significance of defeating death as the ultimate act of separation from his Muggle father, a way of proving that magic makes him fundamentally different from, and superior to, the man whose name he carries but whose blood he despises. The academic year unfolds, and Tom earns perfect marks in every subject. But you notice how he pays special attention to defense against the dark arts and how he lingers after class to ask Professor Merrythought questions that skirt the boundaries of what's considered appropriate, questions about curses rather than counter-curses, about the theoretical limits of harmful magic, about historical dark wizards and what, precisely, made their magic dark rather than simply powerful. A funny thing happens in his second year. Tom Riddle gets appointed as a prefect despite being only 12, because he's just that convincing, that seemingly trustworthy, that good at presenting the face authority wants to see, and he uses his prefect badge the way a corrupt cop uses a shield, as permission to patrol corridors where he shouldn't be, to ask questions that would otherwise seem suspicious, to build a mental map of Hogwarts' secrets while appearing to enforce its rules. You watch the paradox of Tom Riddle crystallize. He's simultaneously the model student every teacher praises and the nascent dark wizard who's already begun experimenting with magic that would horrify those same teachers, already started to view rules as things that apply to other people, already understood that the greatest trick is not to break the system, but to master it so completely that you can reshape it from within, that you can rise to positions of authority that let you redefine what counts as permissible in the first place. You follow 16-year-old Tom Riddle through the corridors of Hogwarts in 1943, and the castle feels different now, darker around the edges, as if the building itself senses something predatory stalking its halls, something wearing a prefect badge and a head boy smile that fools almost everyone except the one professor who's watched him for 5 years with increasing unease. The war rages outside these enchanted walls. Real war, Muggle war, with bombs falling on London and bodies piling up across Europe. But inside Hogwarts there's a different kind of threat, one that slithers through pipes and emerges from a girl's bathroom when called by a voice that speaks in serpentine syllables, ancient as magic itself. Here's where Tom's brilliance becomes truly terrifying. He doesn't stumble upon the Chamber of Secrets like some lucky adventurer. He systematically researches Hogwarts' history, identifies inconsistencies in the official narratives, interviews the one non-corporeal person who was there when Salazar Slytherin walked these halls, and pieces together a mystery that stumped wizards for 1,000 years, all while maintaining his reputation as the most promising student the school has seen in decades. Historians love to point out that 1943 was also the year penicillin was first mass-produced, saving countless lives even as the war took them away. But Tom Riddle is interested in a different kind of legacy, a different way of cheating death than medicine could ever provide. And when he opens his mouth in the girl's bathroom and speaks those commands in Parseltongue, you feel the castle shudder as something enormous, something that's been waiting centuries for its master's heir, begins to wake from its ancient sleep. The basilisk is a weapon of such elegant lethality that you can almost understand Tom's appreciation for it. A serpent 60 feet long that kills with a glance, that moves through Hogwarts' plumbing like a nightmare-made flesh, that leaves its victims petrified and the staff baffled, desperately trying to protect students from a threat they can't see, can't understand, can't fight because they don't know where to look or what they're looking for. You watch Tom play his role perfectly, organizing search parties for missing students, comforting those whose friends have been attacked, offering theories to professors that are just plausible enough to seem helpful while steering them away from the truth, and all the while, he's the one controlling the monster. He's the one who decides who gets hurt and when. He's conducting an experiment in terror that proves how easily even a school full of trained witches and wizards can be paralyzed by fear. The scholarly debate that still rages centers on whether Tom intended to kill Myrtle Warren or if her death was an accident that he then opportunistically exploited. But watching through your second-person perspective, you see the calculation in his eyes when he realizes what he's done. The way he barely pauses before deciding to use this murder, his first murder, to create something he's only read about in the darkest corners of the restricted section, something so vile that even books on dark magic refuse to explain the process in detail. Here's a deliciously dark historical parallel. While Tom Riddle tears his soul in half for the first time, Robert Oppenheimer is being recruited for the Manhattan Project, about to split atoms in a different kind of terrible magic, proving that both magical and muggle worlds were simultaneously exploring the question of whether some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, some power too destructive to wield. And in both cases, brilliant men decided the answer was no, decided that capability equals permission, decided that they would rather reshape reality than accept its limitations. The diary becomes his first Horcrux, innocent-looking black leather that contains a fragment of his 16-year-old soul, preserved in dark magic like an insect in amber, and you feel the wrongness of it. The way the universe itself seems to recoil from this violation of natural law, this deliberate fracturing of something that's supposed to remain whole from birth until death. Tom frames Rubeus Hagrid with a magician's misdirection, pointing authorities toward the gentle half-giant who keeps dangerous creatures out of love rather than malice. And it works because people see what they expect to see. Hagrid looks dangerous, comes from a suspect background that doesn't fit the wizarding world's pure-blood ideal, while Tom Riddle looks like exactly what a hero should be. Handsome and articulate and devastated by the attacks, performing grief with the skill of an actor who studied human emotion without ever quite feeling it himself. Here's an amusing bit of irony. Armando Dippet, the headmaster, awards Tom a special award for services to the school for solving the chamber mystery and saving Hogwarts from closure, giving a trophy to the very person who created the crisis, proving that institutional authority figures are often more interested in neat narrative resolutions than messy truth, more invested in maintaining appearances than acknowledging that their star student might be a monster in training. You watch the aftermath. See Tom return to normal life as if he hasn't just murdered someone and mutilated his soul. And what's perhaps most disturbing is how little it seems to affect him. No nightmares, no guilt, no moment of horror at what he's done. Just a cold satisfaction that the experiment worked, that he's taken the first step toward immortality, that he's proven himself capable of what others wouldn't dare attempt. The historical oddity that scholars obsess over is this. Magical portraits all over Hogwarts witnessed these events from their frames, yet none of them reported what they saw, leading to endless speculation about whether portraits are bound by some code of silence, whether they didn't understand what they were seeing, or whether Tom somehow identified and obliviated or destroyed every painting that might have observed something incriminating, which would suggest a level of thoroughness bordering on paranoid genius. Summer comes, and Tom faces the dreaded return to the orphanage, but something's different now. He carries a piece of immortality in his trunk, hidden under socks and school books, a secret that separates him from every other person on Earth, a barrier between him and death that makes the orphanage's gray walls less oppressive because he knows they can't contain him much longer, knows he's destined for so much more than this, knows he's already achieved something that most wizards can't even imagine, let alone accomplish. You notice how he started to change physically, how the handsome boy is becoming almost too perfect, features sharpening into something classical but cold, like a marble statue that's beautiful to look at but would be terrible to touch, would drain warmth rather than share it. And you wonder if this is the beginning of the transformation, if fracturing his soul has started a process that will eventually render him barely human in appearance as well as spirit. The diary sits in his trunk like a time bomb set to detonate 50 years later, carrying not just a soul fragment, but memories, personality, the preserved consciousness of 16-year-old Tom Riddle at his most ambitious and ruthless before age, and additional murders degraded him further. And in a way, this version of him is the most dangerous because he still has enough humanity to be charming, to seduce and manipulate, to inspire trust in someone like a lonely girl named Ginny who won't be born for decades, but who's already doomed by what he's created today. You follow Tom through his final weeks at the orphanage in summer 1943, watching him experiment with the new magic he's discovered, feeling the edges of his soul fragment, testing whether he's diminished or enhanced by what he's done, and you see the verdict in his eyes. He feels powerful, feels more himself than ever, as if he shed some unnecessary weight, some vestigial conscience that was only slowing him down, and he's already planning the next one. Already thinking about how Horcruxes could be distributed to make him not just immortal, but functionally indestructible, already dreaming of a future where death itself bows to his superior will and magic. You travel with Tom Riddle as he graduates from Hogwarts and steps into a wizarding world that still doesn't quite know what to do with him, this brilliant orphan with no family connections, no money, no political capital, except his considerable charm and the kind of magical ability that makes even seasoned wizards pause and reassess what they thought was possible. The summer of 1945 sees Muggle London celebrating VE Day, victory in Europe. Strangers kissing in the streets as Churchill announces the end of the Nazi threat. But Tom walks through these celebrations with barely concealed contempt, seeing only proof that Muggles, despite their capacity for industrial-scale destruction, are fundamentally inferior to wizards who could have ended the war with a handful of well-placed curses if they'd had the courage to embrace their superiority instead of cowering behind their statute of secrecy. Here's where I get genuinely curious about you, dear listener. I'm really curious. From which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. Now, back to our dark protagonist, who's just applied for a teaching position at Hogwarts, thinking that the defense against the dark arts post would give him access to students he could mold, to the library's darkest secrets, to a position of influence from which he could quietly reshape wizarding education to emphasize power over morality, strength over mercy, the will to dominate over the weakness of compassion. Armando Dippet turns him down with a gentle suggestion that perhaps Tom should gain some life experience first. See the wider wizarding world, and you watch Tom's face remain perfectly composed, while behind those dark eyes, something cold and terrible makes a note. Remember this. Remember who denied you. Remember who failed to recognize your obvious superiority. And when the time comes, when power is finally yours, remember who needs to be reminded of their mistake. The scholarly debate about what Tom did during these lost years between 1945 and the late 1950s is one of the great mysteries of magical history, with theories ranging from the plausible that he traveled to Albania, Greece, Egypt, and other places rich in ancient magic, to the fantastical that he somehow accessed the Department of Mysteries or made contact with non-human magical beings who taught him arts that wizards had long forgotten. You follow him to Borgin and Burke's, where he takes a job that would seem beneath someone of his abilities, unless you understand that working in a dark arts shop gives him access to powerful objects, to wealthy pure-blood families selling heirlooms they don't quite understand, to a network of morally flexible wizards who might prove useful later, and to opportunities for theft that a more legitimate position would never provide. Here's a beautifully dark historical parallel. While Tom Riddle is learning to identify cursed objects and manipulate elderly witches into selling family treasures for a fraction of their worth, the Nuremberg trials are revealing the bureaucratic machinery of the Holocaust, proving that terrible evil often wears a suit and carries a briefcase, that monsters don't always announce themselves with dramatics, but sometimes rise through systems by being helpful, efficient, and superficially respectable until they've accumulated enough power to reveal their true nature. You watch him charm Hepzibah Smith, A rich, foolish woman who collects magical antiquities, like some people collect China dolls, and the scene would be funny if it weren't so calculated. She simpers and flirts with this handsome young man who visits to appraise her collection, never guessing that he's cataloging everything she owns, identifying what he wants, planning how he'll take it, and frame her house elf for the crime in one efficient afternoon of murder and theft. The cup that belonged to Helga Hufflepuff sits in Hepzibah's vault, like a prize waiting to be claimed, and when Tom sees it, you feel his hunger, not for gold or beauty, but for the significance of it. The way possessing a founder's relic would symbolically claim Hogwarts' legacy as his own, would transform him from an orphan with no history into someone who quite literally carries pieces of the school's greatest wizards within his collection of Horcruxes. The historical oddity that makes magical scholars slightly uncomfortable is that Tom Riddle wasn't the first wizard to create a Horcrux, yet somehow he's the only one documented to have made more than one, suggesting either that previous dark wizards lacked his ambition or that there's something in the specific combination of his genetics, the Gaunt family's instability mixed with whatever made his muggle father superficially attractive, that produced a mind capable of fracturing itself repeatedly without immediate insanity. You accompany him on the night he visits the Riddle house in Little Hangleton, walking up the hill to confront the father who abandoned his pregnant mother. And there's something almost Shakespearean in this moment, the lost son returning to claim recognition from a father who doesn't know he exists, except this isn't a recognition scene. This is an execution. This is Tom Riddle killing the Muggle side of his heritage and using that murder to create another Horcrux from his father's ring. The Gaunt ring with the stone that's actually one of the Deathly Hallows, though Tom doesn't know it yet. Doesn't care about children's tales when he's chasing real immortality through blood magic and murder. The three Riddles die that night, father and grandparents, and the village below blames the gardener, poor Frank Bryce, because it's easier to believe that a servant killed his employers than to imagine that something supernatural stalked up the hill and erased an entire bloodline in minutes, leaving no evidence except bodies with expressions of terror that no poison or violence can quite explain. Here's where it gets darkly amusing. Tom Riddle spends years researching immortality, reading every book on life, extension, and soul magic, consulting with dark creatures, and traveling to sites of ancient power. Yet he never seems to consider the simple fact that he's making himself less human with each murder, less capable of experiencing the very existence he's so desperate to prolong, creating an eternity that will be empty of joy, love, pleasure, or any sensation except the cold satisfaction of continued existence and accumulated power. You watch him begin to gather followers in the 1960s, young purebloods who are anxious about changing times, about Muggle-borns gaining influence in the ministry, about their traditional privileges being eroded by talk of equality and rights for magical creatures, and Tom, who's now sometimes called Lord Voldemort by his inner circle, offers them a return to the old ways, to wizard supremacy, to a world ordered according to blood purity rather than merit or compassion, and they flock to him because he's brilliant and powerful and tells them that their prejudices are actually noble traditions worth defending. The scholarly consensus is that Tom created at least 6 Horcruxes deliberately: diary, ring, locket, cup, diadem, and snake, plus Harry Potter accidentally. But there's endless debate about whether he might have created others that were destroyed or hidden so well they'll never be found, whether his soul fragmented beyond his control, whether there's some theoretical limit to how many times consciousness can be divided before it becomes something too fragmented to properly function. You follow him to Albania, where he finds Rowena Ravenclaw's lost diadem in a hollow tree, where Helena Ravenclaw's ghost finally, after centuries of silence, revealed it was hidden, and you watch him turn this symbol of wisdom into a container for soul fragments, perverting everything it represented, making knowledge serve darkness instead of enlightenment, proving that no ideal is so pure that human can't corrupt it, given sufficient motivation and absence of moral restraint. The years blur together as Tom becomes less Tom and more Voldemort, as his features continue to shift towards something reptilian and wrong, as his followers multiply and his reputation spreads, whispered at first, then spoken aloud with fear, then finally proclaimed with pride, by Death Eaters, who mark their arms with his symbol and commit atrocities in his name, believing they're purifying the wizarding world when they're really just indulging every petty cruelty and power fantasy that civilization normally constrains. You witness the systematic destruction of Tom Riddle's humanity across 20 years of murder and dark magic, each Horcrux representing not just a safeguard against death, but a deliberate choice to value existence over essence, quantity of life over quality of being, immortality over every single thing that makes being alive worthwhile. The diary came first in 1943, created from Myrtle's murder, containing the 16-year-old version of Tom who still retained enough charm to seduce a future generation, still possessed sufficient humanity to pass as human even while plotting inhuman acts, still believed that immortality would feel like victory rather than the prolonged emptiness it would actually become. Here's a fascinating historical parallel. While Tom is fracturing his soul throughout the 1950s and 60s, Watson and Crick are discovering DNA's structure, fundamentally proving that life's blueprint is written in chemical code, that heredity isn't magic but molecules. Yet Tom's obsession with blood purity and his hatred of his Muggle father suggest he never quite understood that biology doesn't care about his categories, that magic itself seems to arise randomly across bloodlines, regardless of how carefully purebloods try to concentrate it through selective breeding. The ring came next, created from his father's murder and his grandparents' deaths. The gaunt family ring with the resurrection stone set in gold, and you watch Tom take something that could theoretically summon shades of the dead and use it instead as a container for his own living soul fragment, never recognizing the irony that he's literally surrounded himself with objects that symbolize acceptance of death. The cup of a founder who valued loyalty and hard work, the locket of an ancestor who chose love across blood boundaries, the diadem that represents wisdom's pursuit, while completely missing their actual lessons. Scholars endlessly analyze the order of the Horcruxes, trying to determine which murders produced which soul containers, as if establishing a timeline could somehow make sense of madness, could create logic from the fundamentally illogical decision to fracture your consciousness into 7 pieces and scatter them across Britain like some demented magical treasure hunt that only you know exists. You follow him to the cave where he once terrified 2 fellow orphans, where he returns decades later to hide Salazar Slytherin's locket in a basin of potion that requires blood payment to access, protected by Inferi, who wait beneath black water for any intruder foolish enough to seek what Tom has hidden here, and you notice how he chooses locations that mean something to him personally. The cave from his childhood, the room of requirement at Hogwarts where he found the diadem, Gringotts where his followers' family vault could hide the cup, as if despite fracturing his soul, he still wants some connection to his own history, some thread linking present to past, even as he tries to sever every other human connection. Here's where it gets darkly funny. Tom Riddle spends years creating the most elaborate defense system against death ever devised in magical history, scattering pieces of his soul like an extremely paranoid wizard playing an extremely high-stakes game of hide-and-seek with mortality itself. Yet he never seems to consider that the very act of creating Horcruxes might be making him easier to kill in the ways that actually matter, stripping away the humanity that lets you recognize danger, the empathy that helps you understand enemies, the wisdom that comes from accepting limitation rather than frantically fighting it. The cup becomes a Horcrux after he murders Hepzibah Smith, stealing Helga Hufflepuff's relic along with Slytherin's locket, collecting Founder's objects like trophies that prove his superiority to Hogwarts history, that let him symbolically claim the school that once rejected his application to teach, that transform him from an orphan who attended on scholarship to someone who quite literally possesses pieces of the institution's founding magic. You watch the murders pile up, anonymous muggles, a beggar for information about Horcruxes, wizards who knew too much or refused to join his cause, each death making the next one easier, each killing diminishing the part of him that might once have hesitated, each murder proving his thesis that power matters more than mercy, that magical might makes moral right, that the strong deserve to rule simply by virtue of being strong, regardless of how they use that strength or what it costs them internally. The historical oddity that makes this period fascinating to scholars is how Tom managed to keep his Horcrux creation secret, even from his closest followers. Death Eaters knew Lord Voldemort was pursuing immortality, knew he'd achieved something that made him difficult to kill. But none of them apparently knew about the specific objects or the precise mechanism, suggesting Tom trusted no one, shared nothing, kept even his allies at a distance that ensured they could never truly know him or threaten his plans. You accompany him to Albania where he finds the diadem, where Helena Ravenclaw's ghost reveals what she hid 1,000 years ago after stealing it from her mother, and you see Tom's particular genius for extracting information from those who've kept secrets for centuries. He doesn't threaten or torture the ghost. He seduces her with false understanding, pretends to appreciate her pain, makes her believe he wants the diadem for noble purposes, proving that even in death, even as a fragment of memory and regret, people want to believe that someone understands them, that their long-ago mistakes might somehow be redeemed through sharing. The diadem goes into the room of requirement, hidden among thousands of objects that other Hogwarts students have concealed over the centuries, protected by the sheer volume of magical items that surround it, and by Tom's certainty that he's the only person clever enough to have truly mastered the room's secrets, to understand how to access its hidden configurations, to recognize it as the perfect hiding place for an object he simultaneously needs to preserve but never plans to visit again. Here's a scholarly debate that's never been resolved. Did creating Horcruxes actively worsen Tom's judgment and humanity? Or did they simply preserve who he already was, while the unprotected fragment of soul still in his body degraded without the stabilizing influence of being whole? The evidence suggests both. He becomes more reckless, more prone to theatrical displays of power rather than subtle manipulation, more likely to trust force over finesse. Yet his essential character, his contempt for others, and his obsession with blood purity remains consistent throughout, suggesting the Horcruxes revealed and amplified what was already there, rather than creating new flaws from whole cloth. You watch him in the 1970s, now fully transformed into Lord Voldemort, his face barely recognizable as human, his eyes red where they should be dark, his skin pale as bone, his voice high and cold as a knife across ice. And you realize this is what immortality actually looks like when pursued through dark magic and murder. Not eternal youth, but eternal corruption. Not preservation, but progressive degradation. Not the triumph over death, but the transformation into something that should be dead, but persists anyway through sheer magical force and fractured soul fragments scattered across Britain. Nagini becomes his final Horcrux, created from Bertha Jorkins's murder after his resurrection, and there's something particularly disturbing about putting a soul piece inside a living creature. Something that suggests Tom has moved beyond seeing even animals as separate beings with their own existence, that everything has become just potential containers for his immortality, just tools to be used and discarded and replaced as needed in his quest to live forever, regardless of what living actually means to someone who's discarded everything that makes life meaningful. You stand at the moment of transformation when Tom Riddle stops pretending to be human and Lord Voldemort rises in his full terrible glory, when the mask drops completely. And what emerges is something that's traded every human quality for power, every soft emotion for cold calculation, every connection for complete isolation at the summit of magical dominance. The name itself is revealing. Voldemort. Flight from death in French, except he hasn't flown from death so much as dragged himself away from it while leaving pieces of himself scattered behind like breadcrumbs, like evidence, like a trail that someone determined enough might eventually follow back to its source and destroy everything he's worked to build. The First Wizarding War erupts in the 1970s, and you watch Voldemort orchestrate terror with the precision of a composer arranging a symphony of screams, each attack calculated to maximize fear, each disappearance designed to destabilize the ministry, each murder of a Muggle family or blood traitor wizard chosen to send a message that no one is safe, that blood purity will be enforced, that the old order will return whether the wizarding world wants it or not. Here's a darkly appropriate historical parallel. Just as the 1970s saw real-world terrorism reach new, sophisticated heights, from the Munich Olympics massacre to airplane hijackings, Voldemort innovates in magical terrorism, introducing the dark mark that appears over sites of violence, creating a brand that lets everyone know who's responsible, understanding that fear works best when people know exactly who to be afraid of, rather than dealing with anonymous threats. Scholars debate whether Voldemort genuinely believed in blood purity or simply used it as a convenient ideology to gather followers. But watching him through your second-person perspective, you see it's both. He does believe Muggleborns are inferior because he has to believe it, has to maintain that his Muggle father's abandonment doesn't matter because Muggles don't matter, has to insist that blood determines worth because otherwise he'd have to admit that the non-magical half of his heritage is part of who he is. And he'd rather fracture his soul 7 times than accept that truth. You follow him into meetings with his Death Eaters, watch him sit at the head of the table like a king holding court, doling out missions that range from gathering intelligence to outright murder, and you notice how he rules through fear as much as loyalty. Death Eaters who fail are punished with the Cruciatus Curse. Those who succeed too visibly are watched with suspicion. No one is ever quite safe. No one is ever trusted completely, creating a power structure where everyone competes for his favor, while no one can accumulate enough influence to threaten his supremacy. The historical oddity that makes this period fascinating is how long the Ministry took to respond effectively to Voldemort's rise, years of disappearances and murders before they officially acknowledged a war was happening, suggesting that institutional denial works the same way in magical and Muggle governments, that people in power would rather pretend normalcy continues than admit that their world is fundamentally changing and they're losing control. Here's where it gets grimly amusing. Voldemort spends years building a movement based on magical superiority over Muggles, yet his tactics, terrorism, intimidation, systematic murder, are all things Muggles have done throughout history without magic, proving that cruelty and violence are depressingly human traits that don't require wands or spells. That in choosing these methods, he's actually demonstrating how Muggle-like he truly is in his approach to power, regardless of his magical abilities. You watch him become increasingly paranoid, increasingly isolated, trusting no one except Nagini, the snake who can't betray him because she can't conceptualize betrayal, who serves him because her nature as his Horcrux binds her to him, and you see how lonely immortality has made him. He can't love because love requires vulnerability, can't trust because trust requires sharing power, can't connect because connection requires admitting others matter as more than tools or obstacles to his plans. The prophecy, changes everything, and you're there in the Hog's Head when Trelawney speaks those words about a child born as the 7th month dies, born to parents who've defied Voldemort 3 times, a child with power the Dark Lord knows not, and you watch Severus Snape listening at the door, watching him internalize what he's heard before getting caught and expelled by Dumbledore, watching him run to Voldemort with intelligence that should have been valuable but will actually seal the Dark Lord's doom. Scholars endlessly analyze Voldemort's decision to target the Potters instead of the Longbottoms. Both couples fit the prophecy. Both had sons born in late July 1980. Both had defied him 3 times. But you watch his reasoning and see how his prejudices doom him. He chooses to attack the half-blood child rather than the pure-blood one, chooses Harry Potter over Neville Longbottom because Harry's mixed heritage mirrors his own and therefore represents everything he's spent his life trying to destroy about himself, making the choice personal in ways he doesn't quite consciously understand. Here's a fascinating psychological detail. By this point, Voldemort has murdered so many people that he can barely remember individual victims unless they somehow mattered to his plans, suggesting that mass murder doesn't expand your capacity for significance, but shrinks it. Doesn't make you more powerful but less capable of distinguishing what actually matters. Doesn't increase your control but diminishes your ability to accurately assess reality, because you've dehumanized so many people that you start to dehumanize everything, including your own judgment. You follow him through the planning of the Potters' attack, watch him decide to kill them personally rather than sending Death Eaters because the prophecy makes this important, makes this different from the hundreds of other murders he's ordered or committed. And you see his supreme confidence. He has 7 Horcruxes. He's functionally immortal. He's the most powerful wizard alive. What could possibly go wrong when facing a couple and their infant son in a small house in Godric's Hollow on Halloween night? The offer to Lily is genuine in its way. He tells her to stand aside, says he doesn't need to kill her, gives her chances to save herself. Not from mercy, but from Snape's earlier request, from a rare promise he made to spare her if possible, though you can see he'd prefer to kill them all to leave no witnesses, to eliminate the prophesied threat completely and add one more murder to a count that's already beyond remembering. You watch him enter the nursery where James Potter's body lies at the stairs, where Lily's corpse blocks the crib, where a baby with green eyes and a lightning-shaped scar is crying in confusion. And you see Voldemort raise his wand without hesitation, without second thought, absolutely certain that killing this child will eliminate the prophecy's threat, will prove that no prediction can constrain his will, will demonstrate that he's above destiny, above fate, above any force in the universe except his own power. And then the curse rebounds and the world goes white, and everything he's built collapses in a moment of mother's love and ancient magic that he never bothered to understand because it seemed weak, seemed sentimental, seemed beneath the attention of someone who'd conquered death itself through superior magical knowledge and absolute ruthless will. You drift through the ruins of Godric's Hollow as smoke clears and the Dark Lord's body lies destroyed, blasted apart by his own curse, reduced to robes and nothing else, while a piece of his soul, torn loose by the rebound, latches onto the only living thing in the room, the baby who survived, creating an 8th Horcrux that Voldemort never intended, never knew about, never planned in his elaborate scheme for immortality, proving that for all his intelligence and magical power, he never truly understood the deeper magics he was manipulating. The Death Eaters scatter in panic when they realize their master is gone, some claiming they were under the Imperious curse, some fleeing to other countries, some maintaining their loyalty and going to Azkaban rather than betray ideals that their leader apparently died for, not knowing that he didn't die, not exactly, that something of him persists in a state between life and death, bodiless and powerless, but still conscious, still existing, still waiting for a chance to return. Here's a deliciously dark historical parallel. November 1981 sees both Voldemort's first defeat and the launch of MTV in Europe, the same year that brought both the end of a magical terror campaign and the beginning of a new era of Muggle cultural dominance through technology, proving that while wizards were busy fighting over blood purity, Muggles were building communication networks that would transform their world in ways magic couldn't match, though Voldemort would never understand or care about this, because he'd always seen Muggles as static and inferior rather than recognizing they evolve and advance, while wizard society remains largely unchanged for centuries. You follow the fragment of Voldemort's soul that escaped the ruins, barely conscious, barely more than malevolent vapor, drifting through Albania to hide in the forests where he once found Ravenclaw's diadem, existing in animals when he can possess them, mostly as snakes, because Parseltongue gives him some connection and control, living a shadow existence that's not quite life but also not quite death. Exactly the immortality he wanted, except stripped of power, of influence, of everything that made immortality seem desirable, rather than just a prolonged conscious emptiness. The scholarly debate about Voldemort's missing years, 1981 to 1991, centers on how much awareness he had, how much he planned versus merely survived, whether the various dark creatures that flourished during this period were under his influence, or just taking advantage of the power vacuum his absence created, whether he could have returned sooner if he'd had followers competent enough to find him rather than the mixture of imprisoned loyalists and fearful deserters who remained from his first rise. You watch the wizarding world rebuild, see how quickly people want to forget, how desperate they are to believe it's over, how Cornelius Fudge and others dismiss reports of strange happenings and dark magic as paranoia from trauma. As if you could just decide a Dark Lord is defeated and make it true through institutional consensus and willful ignorance. Here's where it gets grimly funny. For nearly 10 years, the wizarding world experiences peace and prosperity, celebrates the boy who lived without understanding what he carries in his scar, raises Harry Potter as a weapon against Voldemort's possible return, while simultaneously denying that return is possible, creating cognitive dissonance that would be comedic if it weren't so dangerous, if it weren't actively preventing preparation for a threat everyone secretly fears but officially denies. You follow Quirrell to Albania, where he finds what's left of Voldemort. Watch the meeting between the stuttering professor and the disembodied Dark Lord. See the possession begin as Voldemort takes control of a wizard too weak to resist, too ambitious to refuse, too foolish to understand that hosting the Dark Lord won't end well for the host, that you can't share a body with someone who's spent decades learning to dominate every situation and expect to retain control of your own actions. The return to Hogwarts is both pathetic and terrifying. Voldemort under a turban, drinking unicorn blood to sustain himself, plotting to steal the Philosopher's Stone for a proper resurrection. And you see how far he's fallen from the days when he commanded armies and struck fear into the ministry, reduced now to hiding in a professor's skull and hoping an 11-year-old doesn't interfere with his plans. Scholars love to analyze why Voldemort didn't just possess someone powerful, why he chose Quirrell instead of targeting Dumbledore or another capable wizard, but watching the process, you understand. He was weak, desperate, couldn't be choosy about vessels, and Quirrell was there, available, susceptible, already interested in dark arts enough that Voldemort could seduce him with promises of power and knowledge that would never actually be shared, because Voldemort doesn't share, doesn't teach, only uses and discards. Here's a historical oddity. While Voldemort is trying to steal the Philosopher's Stone in 1991 to 92, the Soviet Union is collapsing, ending an ideological conflict that defined the Muggle world for decades, proving that even the most powerful-seeming systems can fall apart when their foundational premises rot from within, which might have given Voldemort pause if he'd understood Muggle history, if he'd recognized that his blood purity ideology was just as brittle as Soviet communism, just as vulnerable to contradictions between theory and reality. You watch Harry Potter defeat Quirrell through the power of love, his mother's protection literally burning Quirrell's skin when touched, and see Voldemort escape again, still bodiless, still waiting, but now with knowledge that Harry is protected by magic he doesn't understand. The Dumbledore has preparations in place. The returning won't be as simple as possessing a body and stealing immortality from Nicholas Flamel's ancient alchemy. The diary resurfaces through Lucius Malfoy's machinations, and you watch young Tom Riddle, preserved at 16 before the worst transformations, seduce Ginny Weasley through written words, draining her life to fuel his return, proving that even a fragment of soul, even a memory made substantial through dark magic, retains Voldemort's essential character, charming when useful, ruthless when opposed, willing to sacrifice anyone for his own purposes without hesitation or regret. The Chamber of Secrets opens again. The basilisk stalks Hogwarts again, but this time it ends differently. Harry destroys the diary with a basilisk fang, unknowingly destroying his first Horcrux, and the 16-year-old Tom Riddle dissolves into ink and nothing, screaming as he dies properly this time, his preserved consciousness erased by venom that's one of the few substances magical enough to destroy a soul container, setting a precedent that will eventually doom all the other Horcruxes when someone clever enough figures out what Voldemort has done and how to undo it. You drift through the graveyard at Little Hangleton as Wormtail performs the ritual, drops the bundled homunculus into the cauldron, and you watch Tom Riddle Sr.'s bone dissolve into potion that bubbles and steams. Watch Wormtail's severed hand splash blood into the mixture. Watch Harry's blood taken by force, taken by dark magic, taken because Voldemort doesn't understand that claiming the protection will chain him to it. Complete the spell, and something rises from the cauldron. Something tall and skeletal with red eyes and snake-like slits for nostrils. Something that's functionally immortal with 6 remaining Horcruxes, but that will never again know joy, love, peace, or any emotion beyond cold satisfaction and burning rage. The Death Eaters return when he calls, crawling and apologizing, and you watch Voldemort welcome them with words that drip with contempt disguised as forgiveness, already planning which ones he'll punish later, which ones he'll test, which ones he'll eventually sacrifice when their usefulness expires. Because 30 years haven't changed his essential nature, haven't taught him that loyalty might be more valuable than fear, that trust might be more useful than terror, that a movement built on pain and intimidation will always be brittle when tested, because people flee from fear the moment they can, while love makes them fight even when fighting seems hopeless. Here's where the tragedy becomes almost beautiful in its inevitability. Voldemort has achieved immortality exactly as he planned, has returned to full power with a body and wand and followers, has everything he spent decades pursuing, yet he's lost everything that makes existence worth maintaining. He can't taste food with any pleasure, can't feel warmth from fire, can't experience the simple human satisfactions that make life meaningful, has traded all of it for continued existence that's barely distinguishable from the death he spent his entire life fleeing. You follow him through his second rise, watching him be more cautious this time, working in shadows while the Ministry denies his return, building strength before revealing himself, learning from past mistakes without learning the deeper lessons that might actually help him win, that fear exhausts followers, that cruelty creates enemies, that ruling through terror means you're always one defeat away from complete collapse because no one's invested in your success. They're just trying to survive your attention. Scholars debate whether Voldemort could have won if he'd been more patient, more subtle, less prone to theatrical demonstrations of power that united opposition against him. But watching his choices, you understand that patience and subtlety require caring about outcomes beyond immediate validation, require thinking of consequences beyond the next demonstration of dominance, require a kind of wisdom that he deliberately destroyed when he fractured his soul and discarded his humanity as unnecessary weight. The battle of the Department of Mysteries sees him duel Dumbledore, and you watch these two most powerful wizards clash with magic that reshapes reality, that animates statues and turns fire into serpents and transfigures elements in mid-flight. And for a moment Voldemort feels alive again, feels the thrill of genuine challenge, the pleasure of testing himself against an equal. But then Dumbledore says, "It is your inability to love that makes you weak, Tom." And you see the rage flash in those red eyes because Dumbledore still calls him Tom, still refuses to use the name he chose, still treats him like the orphan boy who never learned that power without connection is just isolation, that strength without love is just a different kind of weakness. That immortality without anything worth living for is just an extended suicide playing out across decades. Here's a grimly amusing detail. While Voldemort is trying to orchestrate a takeover of magical Britain, Muggle society is developing social media and smartphones, creating surveillance networks and information systems that will fundamentally alter human connection and privacy, proving that the real revolution might be happening in the world he despises, that Muggles might be achieving through technology what he's trying to accomplish through terror, the ability to control information and shape perception at scale, though they're doing it through innovation rather than imperious curses, through algorithms rather than assassination. You watch the Horcruxes fall one by one, the ring destroyed by Dumbledore at the cost of his withered hand, the diary already gone, the locket retrieved from the cave and smashed by Ron, the cup stolen from Gringotts and destroyed in the chamber's basilisk venom, the diadem found in the Room of Requirement and consumed by fiendfire, Nagini beheaded by Neville's sword, each destruction making Voldemort more unstable, more desperate, more prone to tactical errors because he's literally losing pieces of himself, literally becoming less capable of complex thought as the fragments of soul wink out one after another. The Battle of Hogwarts unfolds in the castle where Tom Riddle first learned magic, where he first tasted power, where he first realized he was special and destined for greatness that would reshape the wizarding world. And there's something poetically appropriate about him dying here, killed by his own rebounded curse for the second time, killed by the boy he tried to murder as an infant, killed by magic. He never bothered to understand, because understanding would have required admitting that love matters, that sacrifice creates power, that there are magics deeper than any he'd studied in all his years of pursuing immortality through murder and dark rituals. You feel him dissolve in the Great Hall, the last fragment of soul departing a body that collapses like a puppet with cut strings, and this time there's nothing left to anchor him. No Horcruxes to preserve consciousness, no magical objects to host his fragmented self. Just oblivion, finally claiming someone who spent 7 decades running from it, who traded everything human for a few extra years of cold existence, who achieved immortality in name only because he'd made himself into something that wasn't quite alive, even before the final curse ended his long, terrible, ultimately pointless flight from death. The wizarding world celebrates, and you drift through the aftermath, watching people who survived trying to rebuild, trying to forgive themselves for what they did under the imperious curse, or out of fear, trying to create something better from the ruins of what Voldemort destroyed. And you wonder if any of them understand the real lesson, that Tom Riddle didn't fail because he wasn't powerful enough, or because Harry Potter was luckier, or because prophecies can't be defied, but because he spent his entire life pursuing immortality while systematically destroying everything that makes being alive worthwhile, because he achieved exactly what he wanted and discovered too late that eternal existence without love, without connection, without humanity is just another form of death, slower and lonelier and infinitely more pointless than the quick ending he'd spent decades trying to escape. You close your eyes now, letting the story fade like morning mist, like smoke from an extinguished candle, like the last traces of a dark lord who fractured himself into pieces and scattered them across Britain, only to discover that you can't outrun death. You can only postpone it. And in postponing it, you might lose everything that made you want to live forever in the first place. Might wake up one day functionally immortal but functionally dead in all the ways that matter. Might achieve your life's great ambition only to find it's empty, cold, alone, a victory that feels like defeat, a triumph that tastes like ash, an eternity that stretches before you vast and meaningless as a graveyard at midnight under stars that don't care if you live or die, that shine the same light on graves and nurseries, on endings and beginnings, on dark lords and orphan boys, and everyone in between who has to choose every single day, whether to pursue power at the cost of humanity or to embrace the vulnerability that makes us mortal, fragile, temporary, but also capable of love, of connection, of leaving something behind that matters more than just our own continued existence, something that echoes in the people we touched and the lives we changed and the love we shared before the darkness came, and the darkness always comes eventually. But the light we made while we were here, that's the real magic. That's the thing worth dying for. That's what makes us more than just breathing bodies, counting days until the counting stops. And sleep now. Sleep.